Good afternoon and welcome to AWN's next installment in our Liberating webinar series. We are pleased to be joining you after a hiatus over the last several months. My name is Lydia X Brown. My pronouns are they, them. I am a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses, currently not able to appear on camera, but very pleased to be joining with you in spirit and live at this time. I am AWN's senior advisor and a longtime member of our community advocating for neurodiversity, queer and trans liberation, disability rights, disability justice, and racial justice. And today I am excited to be introducing and facilitating a fantastic conversation with my badass friends and colleagues, DeVan Hankerson Madrigal and Valerie Novack. Our conversation today is on access to broadband internet as a matter of civil rights and disability justice. I'm going to introduce our two wonderful guests, and then we will open our conversation. First, I'd like to introduce to you DeVan Hankerson Madrigal, Research Manager at the Center for Democracy and Technology. DeVan is an advocate for improving technology access and expanding individual rights so that more people can share in the benefits of technological progress. DeVan has spent her career working in communications policy and regulatory matters that expand consumer side benefits derived from technology-based programs and innovation. Before working at CDT, DeVan worked in a dual role at the Institute for Technology Law and Policy at Georgetown Law as a policy analyst and director of external communications. At the Institute, she developed research on digital access for students with disabilities during COVID-19 and on the impact of digital exclusion on the development of artificial intelligence technology. Next, I'd like to introduce Valerie Novack, who is a disabled policy, research, and compliance professional working on inclusive infrastructure and community inclusion for people with disabilities. Valerie started advocacy work in a Center for Independent Living before becoming a 2019 Port Light Fellow, focusing on legislative solutions to inaccessible emergency response practices. Novack has a bachelor's degree in disability studies and urban planning from the University of Toledo and a master's degree in disaster preparedness and emergency management from Arkansas State University. She is currently a researcher at Utah State University, working on solutions to increase community integration. As a reminder on access, you should all have available to you the ability to access the live cart captioning, as well as the ability to see interpretation on screen or change the language channel. A quick pause. We're having a couple of questions about access. So it sounds like the Spanish language channel might be coming in and out a little bit. And the captions are not appearing embedded in Zoom. They need to be currently opened in an external window, which you should have the link for. I'm pausing for a moment so I can ask our language justice coordinator what is happening with our Spanish language channel audio. Okay, this is Lydia still speaking. Can somebody confirm if the Spanish language channel audio is working? Someone says not hearing Spanish. Is it not coming through? And thank you all for your patience. We are committed to ensuring language access and language justice, which sometimes means that our work is slow and messy and takes a minute or several. Patri, are you speaking in the Spanish channel?
This is Jenna Liana. I'm gonna hop in for one quick moment and just do a moment of redirect. I'm gonna ask Patri to take over interpreting, and Natalia, I'm gonna chat you or text you separately on WhatsApp to do some troubleshooting. But Patri, if you could simultaneously interpret right now, that's gonna help me understand if the channel is working. And then Natalia, I'll communicate with you in a moment. Thank you very much. And just continue the conversation, Lydia and DeVan and Valerie. It's gonna help us troubleshoot if you're actually talking, so that we can hear what's going on the channels, and I'll be attentive to it. Thank you so much for letting me interrupt.
This is Lydia. Thank you for that. And we also have an update that captions should now be appearing correctly in Zoom. So you can click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom taskbar to show the captions, if that would be of help to you. All right. So DeVan and Valerie, thank you again so much for joining us today. Our first question is an invitation for you to talk about what broadband access actually is. What is it? Who needs it? And why? And then if you could talk about how your work ties into broadband access.
Sure, I'll jump in here and get started. This is DeVan talking. I was introduced a little bit earlier. I'm the research manager at the Center for Democracy and Technology. My pronouns are she and her. So on to your question, what is broadband, who needs it, and why? And I'll say a little bit about how it ties into my work. So by the FCC's 2015 definition, internet service counts as broadband if it delivers download speeds of at least 25 megabits per second and upload speeds of at least 3 megabits per second. However, this measure is a minimum. It's also 8 years old at this point, and it definitely could use some updating. In 2022, the current chairwoman of the FCC proposed raising the minimum broadband speeds to 100 megabits per second for downloads and 20 megabits per second for uploads. And this decision at this moment is still pending. But what does broadband access mean? What does it mean to have access? Well, to have adequate broadband access is really to be understood as a function of the availability and cost of what's called, quote, high-speed internet services. Because great broadband service that isn't affordable is as good as no broadband at all. For a family of 4, access likely means greater than 25 megabit speeds, especially when a typical hour on the web can include simultaneous use of high and low bandwidth applications like email, web browsing, plus at least 2 high demand applications like Zoom and high definition video streaming, all at the same time, with multiple members of a family in a household using those applications. So the real question is, how much does it cost for a household to afford adequate access to broadband that performs reasonably well for this level of use? So we know that cost is one of the primary barriers to home broadband adoption, especially for people making less than $20,000 a year. That's $20,000 a year. The fact is that internet costs in the United States are more expensive than in any other country. And many people, well, it's more expensive than most countries. developed countries. I won't tag myself to it being the absolute most expensive. I think technically it might be the second most expensive. And many people who opt to not have broadband at home can't afford the internet subscription fees, the computer maintenance, or they don't have enough familiarity with digital tools. Study after study has shown that people with disabilities also use the internet at lower rates, citing cost as a barrier. In fact, they show that people with disabilities are 3 times as likely as those without a disability to say that they never go online. We know that the differences in access and use between people with disabilities and people without disabilities are also driven by differences in device ownership. And I also mentioned that people don't have as much familiarity with digital tools. So those are some of the ways that we know that what broadband access is and what it means. We know that people with disabilities are also less likely to have traditional access to computers or smartphones, and there are cost implications around that as well. Research conducted as recently as 2021 found that among adults with a disability, only 62% reported owning a desktop or laptop computer, while 81% of those without a disability said the same. There's also a gap in smartphone ownership rates, with studies reporting a 16% difference in smartphone ownership between people with a disability and those without a disability. And so who needs broadband and why? In order to live and thrive in an interconnected world, everyone needs broadband internet. That's internet that allows seamless, uninterrupted access to high bandwidth applications. People who need access to medical service provision, they need broadband access. They need broadband internet. They need it for telemedicine services. Students need access to broadband for live streamed instruction. In a post-pandemic world, we have seen how integral broadband is for workers who need to access multi-party video conferencing applications like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, or Google Meet. One anecdote I'll share from the Office of Disability Employment Policy is that employee employment retention for people during the first year of the pandemic tracked closely with the internet services that workers had at home. Workers with disabilities with high capacity internet services at home remained employed at much higher rates than those with lower capacity internet service. Workers with disabilities who had cable, DSL, or fiber internet subscription, of those, 81% remained employed, as compared to only 68.2% of workers with disabilities who did not have internet subscriptions at home. So, I mean, I think it goes without saying that broadband access is necessary for everyone, for everyday uses, and even staying connected to loved ones in a COVID-safe way, which, although people say the pandemic is over, I think it very much is still a concern for people. And so lastly, I'll just say my work ties into broadband access in a couple of ways. As you know, you and I published an article in the Drexel Law Review, which shined a light on the systemic and structural ableism in education that became all the more visible during the pandemic. And that was at a time when many students with disabilities' only option for accessing school was dependent on their home broadband access. And in our article, we highlighted the disproportionate impacts on students with disabilities who were multiply marginalized by racism and classism. And broadly, my research at the Center for Democracy and Technology on online disinformation looks at targeted online harassment of women of color in political life, in order to really understand the larger effects on the quality of representative democracy in the United States. The linkages between this research and the issue of broadband access are that most of the political discourse in this country is taking place online. And so when certain people don't have adequate access, they are not as able to participate in those conversations. And as a result, it really makes a difference into the tone and tenor of our representative democracy, as well as who engages in civic life and who doesn't feel as comfortable or who gets intimidated from being online and representing themselves in a robust way on online platforms. And I'll stop there.
This is Valerie speaking. Thank you so much for that, DeVan. I think that really kind of covered a lot of what we think of for broadband access, and also the importance and necessity of having that higher speed internet. I wanted to just to provide you, I guess, with some more numbers and a broader look. Of that 100 megabit per second speed that the FCC is considering changing their definition to, they estimate that about 23 million Americans across the board do not have access to that speed of internet. Often when we have these conversations, there is sometimes this idea that this is a small problem, or that it's a small number of people who do not have access to high-speed internet, rather than a large problem that is systemic and affecting people both in urban situations and in rural situations. With people with disabilities, the urban-rural divide does not eliminate that disparity. When you are disabled, we find that people that are disabled and in rural communities still experience less access to high-speed internet than their rural neighbors. So it's not only about if you live, out on a farm somewhere, that gets rid of it, and it's not only about poverty, though that is by and large one of the largest, if not the largest factor. But there are also factors that affect people with disabilities, such as accessibility and digital education to use some of these tools. Right now, we have a variety of tools, applications, assistive technology that run on this broadband. So not being able to afford that high-speed internet creates a lack of access to some of those tools. Additionally, we do not have things like accessible websites and digital literacy for people with, say, certain cognitive disabilities, the ability to run certain assistive technologies like screen readers. All of these go into that access conversation because, like DeVan said earlier, if you have the broadband access, but you don't have the money to pay for it, you don't have that access at all. Last thing I think I want to pull out on the access conversation that we only sometimes talk about and was spoken to before was access to sufficient devices that can use this data, or that can use this high-speed service. There is a disproportionate number of people with disabilities that do not have access to things like a traditional computer, a smartphone, a tablet. And so again, even if they had access to the broadband internet, or even if they had the digital literacy to know how to use some of those, if they don't have the device, they still can't do that. Disabled adults are roughly 20 percentage points less likely to have a traditional computer or a smartphone or a tablet. And that's adults broadly. I know we heard earlier about young people and their access to smartphones as well. So that broadband access is kind of multifaceted, where people can't afford it. And even when they can, it may not be available where they live, or they may not have sufficient devices to take advantage of that access.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. This is super helpful information. And I hope that for folks who are joining and learning about broadband access for the first time, that this will help galvanize your interest too in why this is such a critical issue for disabled people in particular. So this leads me to my next question, which, building off of our prior conversation, is whether you can talk about what the implications of inequitable access to broadband are precisely. Who are the most impacted, and how are they harmed by inequitable access to broadband?
This is Valerie, and I'll go ahead and start this question for you. So we've talked a little bit about the implications and how wide they are to not having access to broadband. And this starts from very young up until our seniors with disabilities, whether we are talking about healthcare and the ability to access telehealth services. We are education and the ability to access online services, or now, in a lot of our K through 12, we have certain online portals or different tools that might facilitate things like education, things like reading assistance or math help and tutoring. Whether we are talking about building community or being civically involved in some of those political questions, like DeVan was saying earlier. The amount of inequity that we see with broadband access and who is most impacted creates a compounding situation, because we have people who are people with disabilities, who are people of color, maybe people who are low income, who are already disenfranchised, who are already sort of kept out of these conversations, or are having worse health outcomes, having less access to education, and then this service in internet that is supposed to be a sort of equalizer of access is also denied them. And so that is just yet another barrier to accessing these opportunities, these services and supports that are supposed to be helping to bring more equity to people through this kind of access and this kind of remote access. Right now, we know that people with disabilities are, I think DeVan said this earlier, 3 times as likely as those without disabilities to say that they never go online at all. That is a tremendous lack of resources when we are looking at today how many services and supports, how much access to information is only available online. An example I often like to give when I talk to people is asking if they have ever tried to order an Uber online. This kind of transit is something that has kind of become synonymous with getting around. People think of it as a very simple solution to not having a vehicle, for example, or getting to some place like an airport or maybe a hospital, because we know how expensive an ambulance might be. But something like that is you're unable to do without a mobile phone, a smartphone, and that smartphone having internet access. And so more and more, we are seeing this gap become wider as many of our services and supports are becoming more and more dependent on having that internet access to be accessible. And so it continues to further marginalize and create further inequity for people who are already systemically discriminated against based on their disability or their income. So that harm continues to be compounded for these people with disabilities and others.
Thanks so much, Valerie. I was sort of like just thinking about what you were saying. Just to add on to that, I think other implications that we could talk about for what inequitable access to broadband creates is that, it perpetuates opportunity gaps. It worsens disparities in education, like Valerie was just talking about, also disparities in employment, in medical services provision, and in other sectors of society where the internet plays a facilitatory role. In educational settings, we know that there are a number of complex technology-related barriers facing students with disabilities that predate the pandemic, like disparities in school resources for assistive technologies. But during the pandemic, we also saw that without equitable access to broadband, there was also that issue was compounded. There is not enough support. There was not enough support for care around accessibility technology. And as you mentioned, there's general web inaccessibility, and all of these issues make it really difficult for people with disabilities to participate in the larger society. Inadequate home broadband access also results, as we've discussed, in infrequent use of the internet, which only worsens the sense of alienation and marginalization that people with disabilities may experience. Another implication of inequitable access to broadband is that people with disabilities will continually be a step behind, particularly when it comes to acquiring the technological skills and resources necessary to compete and participate. Without these skills, the likelihood increases for someone with ability being excluded from the workforce, experiencing persistent unemployment and poverty. We know that historically people with disabilities have disproportionately lived in poverty in comparison to people without disabilities. But we know that there are also significant opportunities if equitable access is provided to people with disabilities. As we've seen during the pandemic, a number of people benefited from having access to telework options because they weren't able to be in the office. And my understanding is that this is an option that was hard fought for prior to the pandemic, but we saw how much benefit it brought to people with disabilities by giving them more flexibility and lowering transportation barriers, particularly for people who have disability-based limitations. If the pandemic experience inclines more employers to keep robust telework options on the table, that could meaningfully expand employment opportunities for people with disabilities. And so who is most impacted by inequitable access? I think we've already described that, that low-income people have difficulty accessing broadband internet services. And we know that people with disabilities experience poverty at a higher rate than people without disabilities, as we've discussed, because of educational barriers and employment discrimination. According to the 2021 US Census, 24.9% of people with disabilities live below poverty, as compared to only 9.3% of people with no disability who are similarly positioned. And even among people with disabilities, those most impacted and harmed by inequitable broadband access are those who are additionally marginalized by race and class, which also tracks closely with lower household incomes. According to the Department of Labor Office of Disability and Employment Policy, disparities in access to home broadband services affect youth and young adults with disabilities a little differently. We know that even though there are narrower gaps between youth and young people with disabilities and those without disabilities, there exists a number of racial disparities between young adults that are cause for concern. Between 2015 and 2019, fewer than 70% of African American, American Indian, Alaska Native, or Hispanic youth with disabilities had both high-speed internet and a computer at home, while 80% of their non-POC counterparts with disabilities had both at home. So what we see is that the people who are impacted across the board are people who don't have the ability to afford the cost of services or can't afford the cost of a device. And even in younger cohorts of people with disabilities, those racial disparities, even between students with disabilities, persist. Back to you, Lydia.
Thank you so much for illuminating that. And I don't know if we dropped it in the chat yet, but we should drop in the chat the link to that paper. So my next question, building off of this conversation about the inequities and that our community members and multiply marginalized folks in particular are facing, can you talk about how broadband access is specifically a disability justice issue? What makes broadband access a civil rights and social justice issue?
This is Valerie. I think we have kind of set the stage for at least an understanding of why broadband access is a civil rights issue, why access is a civil rights issue. But like we have both talked about, because access to high-speed internet is so large, affects so many different facets of life, this really is a much larger systemic inequality issue than just I shouldn't say just, it's a hard one, but fighting for a single right or a single service or process that will maybe include immediate access to broadband, or funds to purchase services maybe for low-income individuals who do not have that. While that is necessary and needed, the disparities that we see in broadband access go beyond just one level, just that that income level. Like DeVan mentioned, we know that less than 70% of young adults that are people of color have access to both the device and internet. We know that there are additional intersections that are happening here as far as job skills training, as far as educational opportunities and adequate health care. Sorry about that. And so when we look at this, we kind of know from the beginning, or from this point of view, that it is larger than just a single legislative issue. But on top of that, when we look at disability justice and a desire to create liberation for people with disabilities, we look at that with a few different lenses. One that I think we can right away point to is the idea that the people that are most impacted by an issue need to be part of solving that issue. The glaring kind of irony in that conversation here is that we've talked about how civic engagement is limited by the lack of broadband access. So the way that this issue comes up, we have pretty much created a situation in which the people who are most impacted by not having access don't have access to speak about not having access, right? They are excluded from even having these conversations because these conversations are happening in spaces that they can't access. We know that things like finances come into this, which are very, very strongly tied to things like race and class. We know that we have issues with full inclusion and accessibility, where we might have one-off programs. I will give an example. There are some financial stipend programs that are at city and state levels to help people get access to internet that you have to apply for online, for example, right? And so these kinds of issues mean that even if we were to address this broadband access at a legislative level, we still are going to have massive amounts of inequality, and it will not create a sort of just playing field as far as people's access to internet, because the problem and the inequality there goes far beyond just those legislative solutions.
I was just adding the report that I just cited, the Department of Labor Office of Disability and Employment Policy report. I just dropped in the chat for folks who are interested in looking up the statistics that I referenced in my last answer. But to add on to what Valerie was just saying, we know that broadband access is a disability justice issue, that it is a civil rights issue, as Valerie said, because the discourse where people are, the conversations where people are talking about advocating for their rights, where people are conversing about political issues, where they are coming to learn about how best to elevate their voices. All of that is happening online. We know that broadband access is a civil rights issue because it facilitates our ability as citizens to exercise our rights. One of the major ways that voting and election information gets disseminated is through online platforms. And now a good deal of our political discourse, as I mentioned, exists in digital spaces. And as we saw during our most recent global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, broadband facilitated access to public education. And these are some of the enumerated rights under the civil rights category, the ability to have access to fair access to voting and election information, to have access to public education. As for our right to access government services, as I described earlier, many local, city, and state governments have long since migrated online services public services delivery in some capacity to online platforms. And the list goes on. The very heart of society's civil and political life now exists online, and good access to broadband functions as a pathway to inclusion. Back to you, Lydia.
Thank you. Yes, we know now, especially over the last several years, how much of every aspect of public life depends upon access to the internet and online services. So our next question in the minutes that we have before we turn to Q&A is understanding now the scope of why broadband access is relevant for civil rights, social justice, and disability justice specifically, is how can we move toward more equitable broadband access? What policies and practices do we need?
So I'll jump in here, Lydia. Public interest advocates have long made the argument that more equitable access to home broadband begins with addressing the cost of broadband services first and foremost. Looking across the country, there are some local examples where changes in public policy led to improvements in broadband adoption. However, these improvements ultimately resulted from decreasing poverty rates. For example, a study commissioned by Kansas City Public Libraries and the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition found that the cities with the biggest declines in poverty rates showed the fastest growth in home broadband adoption, particularly among low-income households. One recommendation from this research was that initiatives aimed to improve equitable broadband access should be paired or integrated with poverty reduction strategies and a focus on low-income households. The study emphasized that the focus must be on poverty reduction rather than economic growth more generally. So some of the more specific local city-based policies highlighted from this work include the following 3 recommendations. 1, encouraging internet service providers to offer and publicize discount service plans for low-income households. 2, investing in training for digital skills and literacy at libraries and neighborhood nonprofits. And finally, making sure that investments into, quote, smart city initiatives like digital delivery of municipal services are designed with digital equity and inclusion for low-income households in mind. I'll add that publicizing discount services options to institutions or agencies that work closely with people with disabilities, as well as investing in skills training with these same organizations, would likely help address disparities in broadband access among people with disabilities. Valerie, did you want to add anything?
I was just kind of over here laughing to myself. This is Valerie, because that pretty much perfectly matches the list that I have. The only other things that I would point out, and I realize now that I forgot to answer in the question, the first question about how broadband comes into my work, but also infrastructure spending and a real investment in our broadband networks in underinvested communities, in our rural communities, and that advertisement for things like digital literacy and financial support goes out to our communities, that is not necessarily just a press release or a notification on a website, but that is actively being shared with community members offline, whether that's through mailers or flyers or however that we're getting that word out there, but making sure that we are talking to people where they're at, acknowledging that the broadband access divide is there, and working in other arenas to make sure people have the information that they need.
Hey, Lydia, I don't know if we are going to go straight to questions, but I did want to share some resources for folks when it comes to the broadband access. So the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, offers eligible households access to broadband through the Affordable Connectivity Program, which provides a discount of up to $30 a month toward internet services. And eligible households can also receive a one-time discount of up to $100 to purchase a laptop, a desktop, or tablet. And if you're interested in learning more, please go to fcc.gov/ACP, and I will add that in the chat. And a household is eligible if they meet at least one of several criteria, one of which is participation in SSI or the Lifeline program. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, also provides access to eligible households to discount phone services through the Lifeline program. In order to qualify, participants of SSI are qualified to participate in the Lifeline program as well.
This is Lydia. Valerie, if you have any other resources that you would like to share for people who are here now or anyone that might be listening or watching this later, please feel free to share what those are, what you would recommend that people read about or watch or listen to better understand this issue, or what their options are, or how to advocate for more equitable broadband access in their home communities.
Absolutely. I know we shared the DOL paper that I think a lot is one of the more recent looks at this. There are also some Pew Research information out there regarding disability and internet access. The ARC is an organization that is one of the ones I know of that currently does digital literacy trainings for people with disabilities, specifically to work on some of this assistive technology and internet literacy divides. And as far as personal website accessibility, there is w3.org, which can help make sure that your websites that you might be putting out or websites you might be putting information on are accessible to people to use those. So those are a couple of things that come up right away. I know there was also been some more recent articles. I think COVID sort of pushed this divide a little bit more in the limelight and made it to where people cannot ignore that we have this issue. So I know, I believe Urban Institute, for example, has recently come out with some research that might help direct you some on the internet access, broadband access issue.
Lydia, I'll also share the Kansas City Public Library's report that I cited to as well.
This is Lydia. Definitely share all of those resources after our webinars. We always send an email out to everybody who registered with links to all of the resources shared by our guests. So if there are any others, you can share them in the chat or discuss them out loud, and we will make sure that folks get that information. Now we're going to take a moment to transition to our question and answer time. For those of you who are tuning in, whether via social media or live stream, or here in this Zoom webinar, now is your opportunity to pose questions to our distinguished guests. You may type them into the chat, either in English or in Spanish, and you can specify if you'd like that to be answered by DeVan or by Valerie, or by both of them. And we'll be happy to take those questions or read aloud your comments and responses as you have them. And while folks are sharing their thoughts, I'll just take this moment to invite DeVan and Valerie, if you have any last concluding comments that you want to share, or a call to action perhaps, this is your opportunity to do that.
This is Valerie. I want to, do you have something, DeVan? I saw you went off mute.
Sorry, I'm giving it a think.
I think while you're doing that, I would just throw out, as somebody who works in research and advocacy, I regularly get to come across individuals who are advocating on various issues or doing research on various issues that relate to people with disabilities or that are along with people with disabilities, and am seeing the same kind of increasing dependence on internet spaces as we've talked about today. And on one hand, it has been a great help in reaching people that we may not have been able to reach otherwise, whether that's because of location or time of day or transportation, various reasons that people with disabilities are often excluded from research and advocacy efforts. But I believe there is, I do have a concern and would just try to highlight for anybody out there that is doing this work that there is its own gap when we rely only or solely on digital spaces to do our research work. And a significant number of our disabled siblings and peers are being excluded in sort of that attempt to be inclusive by only relying on those digital spaces. And then to think also about digital access beyond just the computer and the internet. Getting to places, transportation access, for example, has become more and more online, whether that is accessing your public transit schedule on your phone or scheduling something like an Uber or a Lyft. And so not only do we have the barriers of even having access, but sometimes how we provide information or expect individuals to get information in order to interact with us when we're taking public comments, when we're hosting trainings, when we're having other kinds of meetings or doing research, to really try to be aware of the sort of offline population that has a very important voice and may be unable to participate for a variety of reasons that are centered around not having access to that high-speed internet.
So I'll just end with this. Disability, race, and class are all vectors for economic disenfranchisement and exclusion, social exclusion, political marginalization, unfortunately, in our society. And people with disabilities who also happen to be people of color experience entrenched poverty and economic exclusion with much greater frequency and at higher rates than their non-POC peers with disabilities. People with multiple marginalized identities are at risk of being left behind when it comes to broadband access, because historically they have been subject to systemic discrimination that continues in the present day, as well as societal biases, which diminish their ability to, quote, afford adequate connectivity, and the various associated costs can be significant. So if you accept that to a great extent, disparate rates of broadband access across demographic groups, especially minoritized groups, is strongly related to poverty imposed on these communities, then systems should address the various burdens of poverty, inclusive of affordability, low access to informational and social resources, unequal access to quality education, and withheld opportunities for quality employment. So that's kind of what I'd like to end with.
This is Lydia. We don't have any questions coming in from our participants at this time. So, just a reminder for folks who are joining, if you do have those questions, you do have an opportunity to share them. But in the meantime, I would like to ask the two of you one other question, moving outside the scope specifically of broadband, but thinking more generally about how technology policy is relevant to many areas of disabled people's lives, and therefore to both disability rights and disability justice advocacy. What other emerging issues are you seeing on the horizon that are important for disabled people and advocates in the disability community to be aware of in technology policy?
Just to just hop on that really quickly, and obviously it's like probably on everybody's radar. I'm sure Valerie was going to say it if I didn't say it, but at least in my work, I think a number of folks have all in the media, in the legislature, in the public interest community, have raised the flag around generative AI and how it will impact people from all backgrounds. CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology, just released a paper a little while ago on how automated systems don't incorporate non-English languages in their production of automated systems. And so I think if there's ever an axiom that I think is true, is that if the folks who are able-bodied, if you will, who do have access to spoken language are raising an alarm about this technology, that must mean that there is cause for not only concern, but highlighting the issues that might be on the horizon for communities with disabilities, for people with disabilities. And my work in particular has not focused yet on what those might be, but I can bet that whatever has been described or discussed among my peers in the technology policy space, they are probably missing out on the issues that are of concern and should be of concern to us all from the perspective of people with disabilities when it comes to generative AI.
This is Valerie. I think AI is a great one. The other that immediately comes to mind, particularly because I tend to work at the infrastructure and disability sort of crossroads, is EV, electric vehicles. Both as it relates to internet, we saw, especially in the pandemic, where there was an attempt to use things like e-buses to provide high-speed internet to neighborhoods that didn't have it, as sort of a mobile Wi-Fi. But also, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the disability community is often used as a sort of as a reason why we should be moving forward with EV, that this is a population that can get a lot of support from electronic vehicles without necessarily including people with disabilities, and taking a look at how the broader issues, such as needing a driver's license to use an electronic vehicle, or other different issues like that. There are issues regarding the quietness of electric vehicles, and just kind of the smart city idea in general. We have a lot of city planning and urban planning moving towards these larger smart cities, where we're seeing things like the internet sort of integrated into things like our crosswalks, without necessarily taking account for how those need to be accessible for different types of disabilities. People movers and active transportation. And I worry that we will sort of run into similar issues as we may have seen with things like these scooters and bikes, which on one hand were really great for some people who needed to get around, but then we also saw problems of like them being left in the middle of the street and stopping, or middle of sidewalks, and stopping other people from being able to get around, right? So just not being entirely inclusive in thinking about how integrating some of these technology features more and more into our cities may disproportionately affect people with disabilities in a negative way rather than a positive.
This is Lydia. Thank you both so much for sharing those insights. We do, as we are getting ready to wrap up, have a question from our participants. Anna asks, how successful have you seen the improvement when it comes to equity when the government begins to compete in internet providing?
I don't have any specific data on that at my fingertips, but if you follow up afterward, I can definitely find you some resources. I think the relevant examples are places where municipal broadband has been able to be established. Without going too much into the weeds around the competition issue in the broadband provision space, we know that there is a lot of tension when municipalities try to provide broadband, because it is a market that is controlled by some very large companies who want to maintain their dominance, and municipal broadband is a threat. And so I think, there are some resources I could point you to that provide data on when you say successful, how successful those models have been. But I think it's important to note that there are some significant roadblocks for municipalities who are interested in municipal broadband from entrenched players who are not interested in seeing that that model flourish. And so please keep that in mind as you look at the success data, that there are factors that are hampering the success of those programs, or that are throwing wrenches in the gears, if you will, and that perhaps we would see more examples with greater penetration if that were not the case. Valerie, did you want to?
No, I don't have anything to add. I was quickly Googling over here to see if I could find some numbers on some of our, because we definitely, as we've talked about, have, there are some assistance plans. The FCC has some plans or jurisdictions, but could not find any numbers that I could immediately help to answer that. So I don't think I have anything else to add.
This is Lydia, amplifying a follow-up from Anna. How can people who are following along follow up with you, DeVan and Valerie?
You can send me a message on Twitter and I will forward you the resources that I referenced. Sorry, I wish I was quicker at the fingers right now to send the links right now, but because we're in conversation, I don't want to split my attention, but I will definitely share resources on municipal broadband with you via Twitter DM. So follow me on Twitter and send me a note and I will make sure to send you those links.
I can, this is Valerie, also be reached on Twitter and through email. I am not sure, Lydia, if in the emails that are sent out after the webinars are emails will be shared, but I can give permission to go ahead and share that email so that people have access to that if that is a better way to contact me.
This is Lydia. We only share what you give us consent to share. We are not in the business of mass data collection and third-party sharing of information here at AWN. That is not something that we would do. All right, as we close out, I want to thank both of you for joining us today. I want to thank Nancy for all of their hard work in coordinating AWN's webinar program. And I want to make sure to extend a particular thanks to our entire language justice team. We are so grateful to have Jen, Eliana, Charity, April, Yay, Ebony, Patri, Natalia, Isela, and the Kyle Duarte Company supporting our efforts and commitment to language access and language justice. And of course, a massive thank you to everybody on the AWN team who helps to make these webinars possible. Please be on the lookout for more announcements about our upcoming webinars for the rest of 2023's Liberating Webinars. And as we close out, the final question that I will pose to you, DeVan and Valerie, is what is one recommendation that you can offer to everyone here about an activity that brings you joy, pleasure, or care?
I love walking in the grass with no shoes on. It's a grounding exercise and also green bathing, walking through the forest covered with like lots of green cover. It brings me joy, calm, peace, and it helps me to recharge, and it's free.
This is Valerie. Free is always good. I have recently discovered something called diamond painting, which is pretty much sticking little pins onto an image to sort of heighten the look of the image, similar to paint by numbers. And I have found it to be really meditative. And I think the main thing that I get out of that I like to share with other people is that it is take advantage of doing things that maybe at first seem silly or simple or maybe not worthy of your time. I think sometimes I am the type of person who feels like if I'm given the answer already, it's not worth my time. But it was really lovely to be able to sort of create art in a way that didn't take too much of my creative energy, because a lot of the hard work had already been done for me. And I'm learning a kind of appreciation for that kind of relaxation.
This is Lydia. Thank you both for sharing that. My favorite form of care is food, making it, sharing it, and eating it. And with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening for our discussion on broadband access and disability justice. And we look forward to joining you at our next Liberating Webinars program. Have a fantastic evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.